Hello and welcome. I'm Sean Walter, and I'm the author of the book Tales in Somber Tones. The book is a short story collection that myself and artist Karen Ruffles started putting together over 2 years ago now, and have been working on turning into an inclusive modern art and literature project. We had originally planned a live touring show starting in the UK with access materials, readings, physical 3D prints of the artwork that were designed to be experienced by touch. But due to the disaster of the week, month, and year, we've done our best to move that to a live streamed version. And that brings us to today. So, I will be reading three stories, taking a short break, and returning to read three more with the help of our sign language interpreters, and with Karen ready to answer any questions made in the comments below. A short note on the captions, by the way. YouTube doesn't allow live captions for us at this point, but after the video is uploaded and trimmed, the captions should be available, and that usually takes about a day. As for the images, I will be reading an image description to aid those with low vision prior to each story. And so, on with the show. Our first story is A Question of Evil. The image is of a pint glass filled with dark, frothy beer. The froth is made up of both dense and large bubbles, and the bubbles seem to make out a shape. Close inspection reveals the face of a snake. The wind was cold, making the night a cruel, unforgiving one. The few people who wandered the street were in search only for their own poisons, and were unaware, unfeeling, or uncaring of the weather. Apep approved entirely. Nights like this reminded him of the old country, in another time, when nights were his to command. It stirred a mischievous mood in him as he walked down the street. At a crosswalk he paused, looked around for any onlookers, then unzipped his trousers and started to piss. A black liquid streamed out of him, spreading along the pavement. Soon it covered the entire crosswalk. He zipped up his trousers, knelt down, pursed his lips, and blew on the steaming puddle. In seconds, the crosswalk was a solid sheet of ice. He smiled at his handiwork, then went back into the shadow of a shop doorway to await his victim. A few minutes later, a young woman ambled out of a nearby pub. She strolled an awkward path along the sidewalk towards Apep and the frozen crosswalk. A little way down the street, a car started. Apep watched the driver attempt to wipe off the dew-dusted, foggy windshield, and smiled. He whispered words of urgency. Carried on the wind, his voice reached the driver's ear, who stopped trying to clear her windshield and pulled into the street. The drunken woman reached the crosswalk, paused, then put her foot out. "Carol!" someone shouted from behind her. She stepped back just as the car hit the ice. The car slipped, turned, and slammed into another parked car across the street. Apep was appalled. He walked over to the pile of twisted metal and broken glass that was once two vehicles, and was not surprised to see the driver was unhurt. He turned and walked toward the pub, growling under his breath. He could see the driver's future. She would leave a note on the car she hit. The owner and her would meet to discuss the damages, go on a date, fall in love, and eventually adopt a child together, barring any god's further involvement. He took some solace from the life of the drunken woman who was nearly hit, who would go on to defraud several thousand people of their life savings, but it wasn't nearly as fun as what he had planned. He tried to gauge if the events that passed had made the world better or worse, all told, and was frustrated to find that he couldn't tell. He walked into the pub and spotted a familiar face sitting at the bar. The man, his radiant face beaming, smiled at him. "Hello, old snake," he said, raising his glass in greeting. Don't you hello me. Did you see that nonsense? Ridiculous, Apep grumbled, sitting next to the other man. Why did you call out to the girl? You've no right to interfere with my affairs. The man's smile didn't even flicker. It simply went from one of pleasant greeting to the cold, stark warning of a predator showing its teeth. First off, I have every right, and you know it. Second, I didn't call to her. Someone else must have. He sipped his drink. Apep swore under his breath. If I thought you were capable of lying, I'd have your throat out of you in an instant. I'm sure you'd try, but I can't. Besides, you'd miss me. He finished his drink and raised his hand to the bartender. Another for me, and for my friend, how does a pint of Old Peculiar sound? Apep rolled his eyes. Fine, damn you, he relented. Not hardly, the other man bulked. So, what brings you to me tonight? Apep stared at the bar, wishing his drink was already there, not daring to meet the other man's eyes. Beelzebub is dead, he said, finally. The other man furrowed his brow. What? He's dead. I watched it happen. How? Apep shrugged. The usual way. Not enough servants left to sustain him. No true believers of him as he was. Nothing left. Nothing at all. They both sat in silence for several moments as their drinks arrived. Apep finished his in one continuous swallow, then ordered another. Old Beals. You know, at one time, everyone thought that he'd be around forever. The other man shook his head, sadly. Yeah, but everyone thought the same about Ra and Odin and Apollo. I thought you killed Ra, the man accused, though not impolitely. I did. Every night. For sodding centuries. But the bastard would always come back in the morning. And then, one morning, he didn't wake up. Apep took a drink of his beer. You know, sometimes I actually miss the pompous idiot. The other man smiled, but hid it behind his glass. So, how many does that leave on your end of things? Well, there's Set and... The man shook his head. Set is gone. Years ago now. What? How? Oh, Horus and him had a fight. They both lost. The man shrugged. Apep nodded. What about Anubis? Who can tell? They both laughed, but not in joy. It was the laughter of funerals and battlefields, a melancholy, half-mad grasp at happiness. They both finished their drinks. More arrived, unordered but welcome. The other man brightened. What about Nox? Apep shook his head. She's alive, but she's different. She's grown cold and crazy ever since the mortals started leaving the planet and shooting holes in her. I think it's only a matter of time before... The man nodded. So, that leaves... Just me, I think, Apep said, coldly. Then he turned to the other man and smiled. Looks like you might outlast me after all. The man sipped his drink, then shook his head and pushed it to the far side of the bar. He turned to the bartender. Bring me your best scotch, he said. You will outlast me, won't you? Apep cried. The man shrugged. I honestly don't know. I haven't seen any of the others in a long, long time. He sipped at his scotch, then swirled it in the glass. I've been feeling a bit tired as of late. Apep stared at his companion, his jaw hanging low. But that's not right. There are millions of mortals who pray to you. How can... The man shook his head. They pray to a thought of me, a symbol of me. But to me, the real me, only a few. Far, far too few, I'm afraid. But that doesn't make any sense. They still believe in the other one. Surely you'd get some sort of runoff from that. The man laughed. Oh, him. He's been gone for quite some time, too. Maybe not dead, but dormant. No, he breathed. My time is limited. They drank together in silence for a while, neither of them wanting to ask, but both wanting to know. Finally, Apep cleared his throat. How did this happen? He asked. The other man raised his eyebrow and let out a deep breath, slowly. Times change. The unnamed hold sway now. The ambiguous gods. Apep hissed. Those bastards annoy the hell out of me. They can't even pick a damn goal. You think they're agents of chaos? Not at all. Chaos is a goal, and one I would quite enjoy. But they can't even get that far. Sometimes their actions bring more order than chaos, more evil than good the next. I mean, look at the damn invention of theirs. Kills millions of the mortals in an instant, thousands more from cancer later on, and then they go and provide electricity and medical treatments with it? I just wish they'd make up their minds. Apep finished his beer. Another arrived. The other man didn't move. He simply smiled at his drink. It won't be long now, I think. What? I've got very little time left. He took a drink of his scotch and sighed. I had hoped to be able to get more done, you know? But after everything, he shook his head sadly. I really am tired. Maybe it would be nice to rest. Apep stared at his companion, not understanding. But you've been here since the beginning. You helped create some of these mortals. You stood up for them when he was being cruel and unfair. How can they not remember you? The man only smiled. Apep took a pull off his pint, then sat in silence for several moments. Any regrets? He asked, finally. His companion turned to him, exuding joy and nostalgia. One or two, perhaps, but the big stuff, never. Apep nodded, then chuckled under his breath. Bastard, he said, not unkindly. Here's to you. He raised his half-full pint of beer, and his companion raised the remnants of his scotch. It was fun, while it lasted, his companion added. They drank. A short while later, Apep walked out of the pub, confident that he would never see his friend again. He saw a statue depicting old Apollo, standing in a proud pose, covered in pigeon droppings, and he wondered, briefly, if that was their ultimate fate as gods, the great reward, guardian of park benches and bird shit. He glanced out into the street to the crosswalk, still covered in ice. He thought about spreading a little more mischief, a little more evil, before the light drove him indoors. But somehow, his heart just wasn't in it anymore. He sighed, turned up his collar to the wind, and went home. All right, our next story is titled Mercurial. The image is of a socked foot standing against a densely textured carpet. Emerging from the carpet, a hand reaches out and grabs the foot from below. The flesh of the hand is made of the same material as the carpet. The mountain was colossal, the kind of image a child might draw, all peak at too sharp of an angle. And yet, on they went, up a road that made no physical sense in the world. They didn't drive for the very logical reason that the hill was simply too steep for cars, but nobody complained. Nobody asked why the road existed in the first place. Nobody was even tired as they neared a building at the top. Renee knew it was a dream then. In reality, all of his travel companions, himself included, would have fallen over from exhaustion by now. He looked at them, one at a time, letting the dream continue unharmed. There were friends he didn't see any longer in the waking world, people who had grown out of touch as the years went by, as children, relationships, and jobs took over their lives. There was also two people Renee never thought he would see or speak to ever again. Kristoff, who died in a tragic accident, and Thana, who took her own life. Renee smiled. Thana winked at him with her green eyes, just as she'd done so many times in life, and his heart ached at the memory. And then he saw someone he didn't recognize. A young woman walked in the middle of the group, but she moved awkwardly, as if her limbs had too many joints, or if she didn't have enough of them. Renee moved closer to her as they walked up the mountain. "Hello," he said, and she turned to him, her eyes oddly wide. "I'm afraid I've forgotten your name." "Oh, Her eyes stayed fixed on Renee's. Gertrude," she admitted, finally. "Really? Well, hello, Gertrude. I'm sorry, I don't think I recognize you." "You wouldn't," she said, smiling with just her teeth. "I'm new." Renee walked next to her until they reached the summit and the small building there. They stood in a parking lot overlooking a valley thousands of feet below. Renee glanced over the sheer cliff and whistled. Then he looked back to the group. Gertrude still hadn't blinked. Renee found himself staring at her while the others mingled, blinking his own eyes repeatedly as if to make up for it. Gertrude finally noticed what he was doing, looked around to see that nobody else was watching, and blinked. But not with her eyes. Instead, she blinked with her whole face, her eyebrows pushing her eyelids closed, her nose wrinkling with the effort. Renee shook his head and went to talk to Kristoff and Thana. "She's a weird one," he said, tilting his head toward where he'd left Gertrude. "Who is?" Kristoff asked. Renee turned to point her out, but she was gone. Instead, there was a small stone bench sitting conspicuously where she'd been standing. "Never mind," Renee said, turning back to his friends. The dream was wonderful. Renee spent time with each of his forgotten friends, laughing at old jokes, introducing new ones, but he spent the majority of his time with Thana. They had always had a bit of a connection when she was alive, and Renee had missed having her in his life. Hours went by, and the gathering of friends was winding down. Renee was saying his goodbyes, but nobody had seen Kristoff in quite some time. "I'll go find him," Thana volunteered. Renee knew that something was wrong, that he shouldn't let her go by herself. But, in the way of dreams, he couldn't say anything to stop her. When some time had gone by, Renee finally went looking for his friends. His search took him out to the parking lot with its beautiful views. Gertrude stood at the guardrail, staring at the sunset. She spoke without turning around. "You're waking up soon, aren't you?" she asked. Renee paused in his stride a few feet behind her. "What? How did you—" "Answer me!" she demanded. I think so. It feels like it, anyway." Gertrude lowered her head. "I see," she said. "Have you seen Kristoff and Thana? They've been missing." Gertrude nodded, still not turning toward him. "Where are they?" Renee asked. She shrugged. "I don't see how it matters. They weren't the dreamer. They're not important." "Gertrude? Where are they?" She turned to Renee. "They aren't here anymore." She walked over and took him by the hands. "Please, help me," she begged. "Don't wake up. I don't want to die." Her eyes had somehow changed. They were green now, when they had been brown. Renee pulled himself loose from her grasp. "Where did they go?" Gertrude sighed. "They wouldn't help me convince you to stay. Don't you understand?" She walked over to the guardrail, quietly. She whispered. "They didn't even scream on the way down." Renee ran to the railing and looked over the sheer cliff. Far below, he could just make out two familiar shapes. He stood there, speechless, his eyes filling with tears. "Maybe that's the answer," Gertrude said from next to him. "Maybe I can beat you out of the dream." Renee looked over at her just in time to see her smile, awkwardly, and then she winked and threw herself over the edge. He watched her fall, watched her shift and change shape as she fell through the air. Suddenly that wink and her strange-looking eyes made a kind of sense. They looked so odd because they weren't hers at all. Renee awoke, covered in sweat, gasping for air. He sat up and took several deep, unsteady breaths, coming to grips with reality. That's when he saw Gertrude. She was standing at the front of his bed, moving her hands through the air, slowly, simply experiencing reality. Renee tried to scream, but nothing came out. Gertrude turned to him and placed one long finger on her lips. "Shh," she hissed. She backed away, growing larger with each step, smiling her awkward smile, or, possibly, showing off the fangs that grew there. Slowly she merged into the wall, morphing into it until Renee couldn't tell where she ended and the wall began. Finally, he screamed. Renee left his apartment that night, arriving at a friend's house half-dressed and half-mad. 2 days later, he returned. The front door was wide open. His room had been ransacked, but nothing was missing. His friends tried to convince him that it was just a nightmare, that he had left his door open in his panic and someone had gotten in and trashed the place. Sometimes Renee believed them. But other times, he'll be walking down a crowded street, and someone unknown to him, someone new, will be walking by like they don't have enough limbs, or perhaps have too many, and they'll look at him with recognition, and they'll wink at him with eyes that are not theirs. And he knows she's out there, and that she is improving her performance, and that it's only a matter of time before she comes to see him again. Okay. Apologies for my cat. He demanded attention at the same time as the reading was going. So, the next story is titled Cages. The image is of an abandoned building. Cracked plaster lines the walls. Refuse and fallen material litters the floor. Bars are set into an arched hallway. Beyond the bars and their closed door, a shadow is splayed against the wall. The shadow is both man and spider. The legs are human arms, ending in hands. The body is that of a massive spider, and at the front of it, the slope of a nose and forehead can be made out. The shadow reaches almost to the ceiling of the hallway, and its origin is just to the right of the view. Rain battered the rotting and degraded wooden shutters hanging on their long rusted hinges. Wind bellowed through the holes in both the roof and the wall of the old asylum, greeting the decay of time like an old friend. Stephen was pleased. He loved the rain, the slow patterns of it pelted out on the roof, the beat of droplets as it leaked through the ceiling, the feel of moisture in the air. He bristled at the sensation, sending a light mist against the wall. It hadn't been a pleasant day for Stephen, and the rain helped him relax. The bed frame creaked as he rearranged himself on the musty but wonderfully dry mattress, picking up an apple from under the bed and devouring it in one massive bite. He took a deep, dusty breath and let it out into the fabric, staring out the open door of his bedroom, across the hall and out of the barred windows. The moon, peeking through the clouds, was a pale glow in his vision, but he stared at it just the same. A nearly constant companion, he greeted it whenever he could. It was his only regular visitor, and it was quiet and kept its distance, and he liked it for that. Stephen laid in bed, listening to the little movements the rain always brought, the swelling of old wood, the scurrying of small creatures in the garden, the scrape, scrape of an overgrown tree limb upon the window. Footsteps echoed down the hallway, drawing Stephen's attention. Wet, hurried steps, and the alien friction of a rubber overcoat. Stephen quickly crawled under his bed and waited, his legs unwittingly poking out from the back of the mattress. A man walked by Stephen's room, mumbling under his breath, his overcoat streaming small droplets of water onto the dirty floor. Stephen waited for a moment for the man to pass, and then followed, using paths that only he knew. The man walked all the way to the old administrator's office. He walked in, removed his overcoat, hung it on the coat rack, and sat down behind a large oak desk, shuffling papers around and sighing. Stephen watched from a hole through the wall in the next room, hidden, curious. The man at the desk opened the top drawer, mumbled something to himself, opened another. He pulled out a gray folder, opened it, and began checking boxes and writing in the blank spaces. Stephen watched, fascinated. He particularly liked the scrape of pen on cheap paper, but not the strange, wet movement of the man's lips as he mouthed what he wrote. He could just make it out over the rainfall. Patient exhibits severe delusions of grandeur, believing himself to be King George. Not the current George, but King George the First. Keeps threatening to invade other patients' rooms, demands taxes. Stephen waited patiently while the man wrote, enjoying being hidden. When the man finished, he stood and went to a bank of filing cabinets against the far wall. He opened a drawer that had no bottom, thumbed through files that weren't there, then dropped his own file through the drawer and onto the floor. Not seeming to notice, he closed the drawer and went back to his desk. Stephen looked on in fascination as the man gathered his overcoat and marched back down the hallway, his hobnailed shoes tapping on the stone floor. He listened to the man leave, only losing him as he passed into the main foyer. Stephen waited for an hour, nonetheless, before he moved, just in case he was wrong. Satisfied, he went back to his room, dragging his fingers along the walls in time-worn grooves as he moved. The cool night air brought with it the dew. It glistened on the cold stone and shone like a million stars reflecting the moonlight. Stephen watched the light dance as he passed and smiled in his own way. The intruders weren't uncommon. Strangely dressed figures going about their business, acting in a way that even Stephen felt was somehow very odd. He never approached them. He didn't like people, and given the very rare occasions that anyone saw him, it seemed like people didn't like him either. He hated when they screamed, and they always screamed when they saw him. He entered his bedchamber and skittered his way to the far corner. Underneath some fallen plaster, tucked into the wall, he found his suitcase of treasures. He opened it, running his fingers along each unique piece therein. He took pleasure in the shapes and textures, the shine from a broken pair of glasses, the cold detail of a stone minifigure, the almost liquid-smooth texture of an old blue glass marble. He delighted in them all. "Cheater!" came the voice from down the foyer down the hall. Stephen expertly placed his treasures all back in their places of his suitcase, closed the lid with one hand, and with two others, in one fluid motion, hid the suitcase. "I didn't cheat! It went out fair and square!" called another voice, higher than the first, with a squeaky quality that sent Stephen's brain on edge. Stephen seemed to melt into the fabric of the shadows as he slowly made his way to the foyer. Two children were gathered around a small chalk circle, arguing in the method of children everywhere. Whoever has the last word wins. "It never left the circle. At best, it stopped at the line, and that doesn't count," the first boy shouted, gloating in his mastery of the rules. "Most of it was out. It counts," the screechy one replied. Stephen palmed his way closer to them, taking care to avoid the pile of debris on the ground, hiding his massive bulk in the shadow of a support column. "Fine, then let's have a do-over." "Fine, but I still say it was mostly out." The boy carefully placed several small spheres of different size and color back into their appropriate location from the moment ago, moving about in the gloom and moonlight with unsettling ease. Finally ready, the second boy took up position outside of the circle, and with a large sphere resting against his thumb building pressure against his pointer finger, he shot the sphere into the circle. Colored orbs flew every direction, rolling across the room, bonking off the stairs and columns, and one, a piercing blue glass marble, rolled right to Stephen. He picked it up without thinking, marveling at the color in the moonlight and the cold, smooth surface. He was so enraptured that he scarcely noticed the boy standing in front of him. "Oh, hey, mister," the boy said, holding his leather bag of winnings in his fist. Stephen froze. This wasn't screaming. This was new. "If you want to play, you've got to get your own marbles," the boy continued, reaching to take the treasure from Stephen's hand. Stephen recoiled and backed up a pace, cradling the marble to his chest. The boy gave him an appraising look, shrugged, and said, "Fine, keep it, but I'm telling." And then he turned and calmly went back to his friend. Stephen wasted no time. He retreated back to his room like a shadow from a torch, cradling his marble in a clenched fist all the while. He quickly crawled under the bed and listened for the children, but all was silent in the asylum. Time began to turn the darkness into a pale gray of dawn, and Stephen emerged from the bed. He opened his hand to view his new prize, and let out a dry gasp. The marble was gone. Frantic, he went to his suitcase, opened it, and saw the pale blue marble sitting there, undisturbed, just as he had left it. He stared at it for a moment, confused but pleased, before he put the suitcase away again. A crash came from the floor above, and Stephen jumped in alarm. He crept through a hole in the ceiling and made his way to the noise. "Don't!" someone cried. It was coming from the old washroom on the other side of the building. There was only one way into that room, and the other side was blocked with a massive iron gate, but there was a hole in the wall there, and if Stephen stood tall, he could just see through into the washroom. Stephen peered through that hole, looking into the gloomy washroom. There was a child there, sitting with his back against the wall. He seemed to be bleeding, but Stephen wasn't sure of anything at the moment. A man walked into view, holding an iron pipe. What did you tell them?" he said, and slammed the pipe into the wall next to the child's head. The child flinched and covered. "I didn't tell them anything! I swear I didn't!" the child screamed. Stephen was tired, and he was confused by the day he'd had, but he could tell the child didn't want to be there. He wanted to help, but he didn't know how. He moved his many hands to get a better grip on the wall, and a brick fell from his viewing point. It crashed and shattered on the tile floor. The man turned around, looking through the locked iron gate. "What the hell was that?" he shouted. Stephen turned to where the man was facing, but he didn't see anything strange. Just his own shadow on the wall, cast by the morning light. The man dropped the pipe and ran. Stephen listened to him as he went down the stairs, through the foyer, and out the front door. The child stood up and looked through the bars at Stephen's shadow, a confused look on his face. He grasped at his wound, closed his eyes, and slowly shook his head. When he opened them again, the shadow was gone. He tilted his head to the side, looked around the room, then said to the open air, "Thank you." Stephen watched, hidden, as the child made his way out of the manor. Once he was safely away, Stephen went back up to his bedroom. There was a man sitting on the edge of his bed. He quickly hunkered down, flattening himself against the floor, emitting a noise that may have been a dry and brittle hiss, and shuffled into the corner. "Who's there?" the man said, reaching into the darkness near the bed and producing a pair of thin glasses. He put them on and blinked at Stephen. "Oh, hello there. I didn't see you come in." Stephen glanced one way and then the next, considering his retreat from the strange man without assent. "Is it time already?" the man asked, his thin hospital-gray clothes blending him into the bed. He seemed to hear something from the doorway. "Oh, no, I'm just talking to my new friend here," he replied to the door. "Only, he doesn't really say much." He turned to Stephen once again. "Are you mute?" "I'm the gardener here." He reached a hand out towards Stephen. Stephen backed himself further into the corner, his hands pressing him up the wall. The man looked disappointed. "That's all right," he said, nodding to the empty doorway. "They won't shake my hand either." He looked almost familiar to Stephen, like a memory being viewed through the chaos of a kaleidoscope. The man stood up and pushed his feet into a pair of small gray slippers. "I'll be along in a moment," he said to the air as he buttoned his shirt. After a few seconds, he turned and winked to Stephen, who considered retreating into the crypt and lamented not being able to reach the comfort and safety of his bed. The man finished buttoning his shirt, then smiled. "Do you like apples?" he asked. Stephen bristled. The man walked toward Stephen, still smiling, and reached out his hand. Stephen looked from the smiling face to the outstretched hand and back again, darting glances toward the door and the hole in the ceiling, but the strange man didn't flinch. He didn't retreat, nor did he reach further. He simply waited, pleasantly. Stephen focused on the hand, watching for any movement, and slowly, as if sneaking up on a nightmare, he reached a hand forward. Inch by inch, he moved closer, closer, until he was almost touching the strange man's hand. He locked his gaze onto the man's blue-gray eyes, then grasped at the proffered hand and passed right through it, as if it were fog. Confused, Stephen tried to grip it again, and again he passed through. He looked up at the man, who only chuckled. "Well, that's a thing," he said, and chuckled once again. And then, slowly, he faded away. Stephen blinked his many eyes at the darkness, then crawled into bed and sulked. There were too many visitors for one day, too many odd humans doing odd things. Outside, the rain was just beginning to fade away, and he had wanted to go explore the garden today for any fresh apples, but no. Today had been too strange already. He settled down into the mattress and tried to relax. Soon, he was sound asleep. Alright, we are going to take a short break, maybe 5-10 minutes, and we will be back just after that. And we're back. Hope everybody had a good break. Our next story is called Charmed. The image is of a tiny black stone figure shrouded in shadow. The body seems to be that of a cat, but the face has eroded with time or abuse, leaving only holes for eyes, giving the face the appearance of a monkey. The sun was low in the hills, hanging in clouds of orange and pink and a blood-red sky. Their bags still lay scattered on the living room floor, being unpacked one piece at a time as they required things from their trip. Neither of them had gone back to work after returning from their vacation. They had called in every outstanding sick day, every floating holiday that they had to prevent losing their jobs, but they'd given up on returning the phone calls and the urgent texts. There just didn't seem to be much point to it all anymore. Claire and Anthony spooned on the sofa, watching an unfortunate infomercial on a new and improved way to cook fish. Neither of them knew where the remote was. "People have been eating fish for millions of years," Claire said. "You'd think we'd know how by now." Anthony didn't reply. He simply lay there, unblinking, stroking Claire's hair, remembering the trip they had taken. "Do you want to get something delivered soon?" Claire asked, elbowing him in the side. Anthony grunted a semi-positive tone. "Anthony?" Claire rolled over and burrowed her head into his chest. "Do you still hear the voices?" Their vacation was a long time coming. They were both professionals. They wore suits and worked in offices where how well you bantered with your coworkers was just as important as your ability to do your job, and they both wanted to go somewhere where they didn't speak the language, but where they could be pampered. They settled, after very little research, on an area of Egypt far away from the more well-known ruins, but that still had highly recommended hotels and restaurants. They were deeply disappointed that most of the staff, the cabbies, the servers and hosts, and several people who were vending items in the street all spoke English. "Well, at least we won't have any trouble in an emergency," Anthony said. Claire rolled her eyes. They had been on vacation for 3 days. The shops and restaurants nearby to their hotel had lost their allure, and they had spent the day exploring further areas on foot, trying to find something interesting to take home with them. Claire had found a vendor of spices and dried fruits, and was neck-deep in negotiation with an irritated shop owner over the price. So Anthony took his leave of her and went across the street to a seller of oddities and souvenirs. He looked over the compressed sand sculptures of the pyramids, the plastic recreations of reed ships, and the bobblehead figures of palm trees with sunglasses, groaning internally. He nodded politely to the vendor. "Sorry to be a pest," he started, "but I don't suppose you have something a little different for sale?" The vendor stared at him for a moment, then smiled. "Sir would like something special to take home with him?" he asked, winking as obviously as he could. "Oh? No, nothing like that," Anthony flustered. holding up his hands in innocence. I'm just looking for something a little bit more unique than these. The vendor nodded in understanding. I have a few things you might like, he said, and pulled out a small tray of items from below the counter. Anthony looked over the pieces in the tray, the vendor describing them as he went. There were bracelets made by local craftspeople using local materials, some rings and pendants of silver and gold. And then there was a collection of things which were very obviously not local. What are those? Anthony asked. Ah, well, you see, Egypt is very old. We were trading throughout the Mediterranean and all along the coasts of Europe and Africa before Troy fell and spawned the refugees who would form Rome. And in all that time, we have collected things from other places, he explained, indicating the jade tiles and ancient coins from places Anthony had never heard of. He spotted a small figure in the pile, scarcely an inch tall, made of a strange, dark stone that had, at some point, been tumbled and chipped among other stones or in the sea. Where did this come from? He asked. The vendor examined the figure, running his fingers over the deeply carved lines making up the body of a cat in a sitting position, noting the oddly rounded face and deep holes left there. They gave Anthony the impression that it was watching the both of them in shocked interest. I don't know, sir, the vendor admitted. It could be one of ours, but it could have just as easily come from anywhere else. You think so? The vendor smiled. It's a cat, sir. People like cats. Anthony laughed, and he bought the figure. The vendor put it in a small velvet bag, and Anthony put the bag in his pocket. He made it back to his wife just in time to see the end of the negotiations, which settled on a price just a little more than the shop owner had originally quoted. They did, finally, move from the sofa, if only because it was more comfortable to spend the night in their bed. But neither of them slept. They lay there, motionless, barely even breathing, hands resting against one another for the reassurance touch brings. They would be out of money in 2 weeks. Every drop of savings would be gone, every hiding spot for cash raided. Anthony tried to do the math in his head, and was surprised to find that he didn't care. Yes, rent was coming due. Yes, food was getting scarce. But none of that mattered anymore. Anthony wondered if, perhaps, it never did. That night, Claire and Anthony ate dinner at a fantastic place about a mile from their hotel. The food was vegetarian, and it was absolutely delicious. Anthony reached into his pocket to pay for their meal and pulled out the little velvet bag along with his money. What's that? Claire asked, reaching for the bag. Anthony quickly snatched it away from her. Nothing, just something I picked up earlier. She glared at him in mock outrage. Are you buying weird shit again? She asked, raising an eyebrow. Did you find a monkey's paw, a cursed lamp? She reached out for the bag again, and Anthony pulled it away, laughing. You know, we have ways of making you talk, she said in a bad German accent. Torture? He smiled. Of a sort, she smiled back. They both erupted in laughter, drawing pleasant looks from the other diners. It's just an old figure, Anthony admitted, dumping it out of the bag and into his hand. Barely worth mentioning. He stared at the figure in his hand for several seconds, looking into the hollow eyes, stroking the rough stone. Somewhere on the edge of hearing, something called his name. Claire poked him in the side. Anthony, she called, moving his face in front of hers. Did you stroke out there for a second? Anthony shook his head. Oh, sorry, I was miles away. He stood up and put the figure back in his pocket. Do you want to head back to the hotel? He asked. I'm kind of tired all of a sudden. The rest of the evening passed pleasantly. They put a movie on their tablet and fell asleep in each other's arms. It was still dark when Claire awoke alone in the hotel bed. She could hear something coming from across the room, a kind of halting, staggered whisper. "Anthony?" she called, but the whisper kept on. She turned on the bedside lamp and saw Anthony, nude, squatted down in the corner, whispering into his fists that he held clasped together in front of him. She went to him and gently laid her hand on his shoulder. He jerked back, beads of sweat flinging from his face. His eyes were wide and wild and mad. He pulled Claire down to the floor and hissed, "Do you hear it?" "What?" "Do you hear it?" Anthony shouted, then whispered, "It won't be quiet. It keeps talking, telling me things. Things I don't want to know. Things I shouldn't know." He opened his fist and held out his hand to her. There in his palm lay the small cat-like figure she'd seen at dinner. "Listen," Anthony breathed, holding the figure up to Claire's ear. She tried to push his hand away, but it was already too late. She no longer wanted to. Claire opened her eyes. There was a stench in the air, much more repulsive than her own unwashed body. She looked over at Anthony and saw what it was. She couldn't tell how long he'd been dead, but it was long enough for rot to set in. She gathered together what strength she had left and sat up. When was the last time I ate? She thought. She couldn't remember. Her memories were cloudy, unorganized. Nothing seemed to make sense. She stood up, slowly, unsteadily, and shuffled down the hallway to the living room. She fell to her knees next to Anthony's luggage and felt a bone snap like a dry stick. She paid it no mind. After all, it didn't really matter. She dug through his suitcase until she found a small velvet bag. She pulled the tiny figure from the bag and held it to her ear. She closed her eyes and breathed deep. And she listened. All right. Next up, we have The Borrower. In this image, the foreground is decorated with dew-covered cobweb, disused and abandoned. Beyond it, a fox skull is looking away from the viewer. It seems to have horns sprouting from its skull, made of twisted branches, and a beard made of lichen. On the cobweb, each tiny dewdrop reflects the creature beyond in minute detail. It was a cloudy, moderately warm day. Perdita sat in her kitchen, staring out into the garden of the cemetery beyond, wishing it were colder. She looked at the confused plants, some wilting to brown, others budding and flowering, and knew that something was wrong. She sighed. It had been an oppressively hot summer, and she'd been looking forward to the day that she would finally be able to explore the graves. It was one of the few places in the city where nature was allowed to grow unimpeded, and she'd missed the wildness of nature ever since she moved here. Movement caught her eye. Through her window, she watched as a slender fox crawled through a hidden hole in the garden wall. It paused to bite at its backside a moment, then straightened, sat, and looked around. It froze when it spotted Perdita spying on it through the window. Slowly, it rose back to its feet and began to back away. Then, all at once, it turned and dove back under the wall. "That does it," Perdita said to the universe at large. She stood up, put on her boots, grabbed some grapes and seeds to snack on, then went outside and climbed over the garden wall. She landed in soft earth, moss and grass, and immediately she felt more at home. It was almost as if she were welcome there. Graveyards had always been described to her as eerie, tragic places, but she found that they were calming, somewhat wild, when left to their own devices. And this one had been. Ivy grew up and around many of the headstones, blotting out the name of the dead below. She strolled through the underbrush, careful not to step on any of the burial plots, lest she be dragged under by a vengeful corpse, like the urban legends told. Besides, stepping on them felt like a rude thing to do. She was moving further and further back into the older parts of the cemetery, looking for the oldest grave, looking for the guardian. She didn't know when the practice began. She only knew that her grandmother had told her that the first creature buried in the graveyard would be kept there, forever, as its guardian. Some believed that the guardian was there to help the dead move on, to guide them to the other side, but Perdita's grandmother always thought that was rubbish. People will always believe a comfortable lie over a dangerous truth, she would say, while in her cups. If pressed, she would go on to say that nobody would have ever gotten the title of guardian, but would say nothing more about it. Perdita found an old, overgrown path that wove its way along the small hills in the yard, which were more organic than the newer rows and columns that were organized against any creativity or beauty. She followed it past an old dead tree, planted even before the markers and statues came in. A flash of orange showed that she had found her friend the fox. It had poked its head up between the roots of the old tree, and as she watched, 3 smaller heads popped up to join it. She was being watched by 8 curious eyes as she passed. She did her best not to disturb them. This was their home, and she was just a guest here. She made her way along. The identical markers made way for more unique ones. Unique markers fell away to roughly rounded stones and strangely ornate statuary, testament to the poor and rich people buried here. A few yards further on, she stumbled into a small area full of long, wet grass. She laid out her jacket like a picnic blanket and sat down to eat her provisions. The drone and noise of the city seemed to be far away. She wondered, briefly, why the locals didn't come here more often. She suddenly felt that she was being watched. She glanced around, spotted a blackbird sitting on a hand of a nearby statue, watching her eat with keen interest. Perdita smiled and tossed a few grapes on the ground below it, but the bird didn't move. She tried the seeds next, but still the bird held its place. She stood up and tossed more food, this time closer, and closer still. Finally, she tossed a grape directly at it, and it bounced off with a wet plunk. Perdita laughed, finally realizing the bird she was trying to feed was part of the statue it rested on, and was made of stone. She smiled at her private embarrassment. Finished with her snacks, she sat back and stared at the clouds, letting her mind wander. She thought of the dead buried here, if they might feel the pressure of the earth all around them, and if they wondered why they could no longer control their own rotten bodies. She shivered at the thought. When the sun began to set, she gathered her jacket and started to make her way back to the garden wall. Her search for the guardian would have to wait for another day. She felt recharged and oddly happy, as if she had been needing this excursion for a long time. Someone giggled. Perdita jumped and looked around, her eyes searching, but no one was there. Just the ornate statue she had seen before, with the bird sitting on its... The bird was gone, as were the grapes and seeds she had thrown. Maybe I'm more exhausted than I thought, she wondered, as she slowly backed away. The statue's eyes seemed to follow her, which she knew was the way of statues, and yet it unnerved her. She made her way along the winding path, but couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. It wasn't the statues, and it wasn't the patchwork of wildlife that lived in the cemetery. Something else, something older, was watching her. Her grandmother's words came to her as if to fill the gap left by an unasked question. They wouldn't give a guide the title of guardian. She paused. The long shadows mocked her vision as she darted her eyes all around. How old is this place? She thought, trying to recall. A gust of wind blew past, and it felt as if something, had run its fingers through her hair. Does the first thing buried in a graveyard have to be human? She moved on, but the growing night made her path seem alien. She spotted the dead tree in the distance and headed toward it, looking over her shoulder every few steps, trying to catch sight of what she knew was stalking her. Her skin tingled and her heart pounded. Every fiber of her being seemed to be screaming at her, warning her of the impending danger so ancient that it was felt instead of seen. She looked back once again, tripped on a root of that long-dead tree, and fell hard to the ground, striking her head on a gravestone, falling unconscious. She awoke, and yet she didn't. She looked down at herself, lying in the dirt, and wondered if she were dead. No, came the answer, echoing all around her through the graves and trees. Perdita found that the shadows of the cemetery no longer kept their secrets from her. She witnessed hordes of the dead, translucent but human, wander around the paths and forgotten lanes around her, going about business of their own. And yet she was no longer afraid. Several of the dead stood and pointed. A few of them smiled at her. One smiling child waved. She wondered if she were dreaming. No, was the answer, seeming to be spoken by the air itself. She closed her eyes. What are you? She thought. There, so large that it appeared to be part of a distant hillside, blurred by the mist surrounding it, something turned toward her. Perdita blinked in the harsh morning light. The dew hung heavily on her clothes and on the tree above her. There, nestled into the roots, sat a strange black stone, a burial marker unlike anything she'd ever seen. She blinked again, and it was gone, blending back into the underbrush. She groaned. Her head felt as if it had been split in two. She sat up and looked around, trying to recall the strange dream she'd had while she was unconscious, but her head seemed to throb worse the more she thought about it. Slowly, unsteadily, she made her way back to the garden wall. 8 eyes watched her leave, and something else entirely merely observed her passing, keeping watch on the odd intruder. All right. Our last story for you today is titled In an Instant. The image shows popcorn spread haphazardly on a dark surface. The kernels seem to form shapes. Here, a grinning skull. There, a pulsating brain. It gives the snack an altogether unsettling appearance. He looked through his window and out onto the city. It was raining. It was always raining. Living in Seattle, it seemed to do little else. He sighed. The rain was fitting, he thought. It should be raining on a night like this. He glanced down to his pistol in his hand. felt the weight of it, along with the weight of his intention. He closed his eyes and took a deep breath. A loud crunch came from behind him. He turned to see a strange girl sitting on his sofa. She was loudly eating from a bag of popcorn. She took another great handful of fluffy kernels and attempted to shove them into her mouth, more missing than succeeding. "How did you get in here?" he asked, putting the gun behind his back reflexively. "Oh, and it was just getting to the good part," the girl replied, setting the bag down and licking her fingers and palm haphazardly. She looked over to the white wall next to the man. "It always makes such fun patterns on white. Maybe it's the contrast?" "What?" She smiled. "The blood, silly. Well, and brains, of course. Oh, and tiny bits of skull." She squished her face into a look of mock disgust. "I always wonder if the brains know that they hit the wall. What do you think?" She turned to the man once again. "Who are you? How did you get in here?" the man asked, tucking the gun into the belt behind his back. "Oh, don't hide it. If you hide it, you'll never get to the good part." She tried to pout, but her lip refused to cooperate. She attempted to glare at her own lip and tried again. Finally she succeeded, forcing her lower lip out with a third try and with some assistance from her hand. She pointed to the lip with pride and gave a thumbs up to the man, who stared in astonishment. The man blinked at her. The girl stirred on his couch, uncomfortably, looking to the floor and ceiling, avoiding his gaze. Finally she cleared her throat, sat up straight, and raised her hand high, straining against gravity, staring at him in a perfect facsimile of seriousness. The man furrowed his brow at her, but shrugged and said, "Yes?" "Oh, what was your question again?" "Which one?" She shrugged. "Which one do you want answered?" "How did you get in here?" The girl smiled. "That's a stupid question. Honestly, given the choice, I would have asked for the meaning of life or how to get $10 million by tomorrow without getting arrested. No wonder you want to kill yourself." She rolled her eyes at him. "Anyway, I get in the same way I go anywhere." "It's not funny," the man said, his voice cold. "What's not?" "You don't joke about suicide." "Who's joking? That's not a prop gun in your belt, is it?" She leaned as far as she could, while still sitting cross-legged on his couch, and trying to peer behind his back. He turned to hide the pistol better. She fell to her side, legs still crossed, but now dangling in midair. "Totally real," she said, half muffled by the fabric of the cushion. "That's not the point. You don't just make fun of things like that," he chided. The girl righted herself. Her hair, tied horizontally on both sides of her head, flopped with the motion. "What? Who says? Seems like a silly rule to me." "Just people, okay? It's not something people do." The man let out an exasperated sigh. The girl blinked at him. "That's a stupid rule. You're stupid. You should kill yourself." She smiled in triumph. When the man didn't say anything, she continued. "See? Because I made fun of it. And I'm people. Kind of. More or less. So I win." The man clenched and unclenched his jaw. "Get out," he said, simply. "Don't wanna. You're fun." She picked up a piece of fallen popcorn from her shirt and threw it at him. It bounced off his face. "Besides, you need me." "I need you?" he replied, incredulous. "I'm having the worst night of my life and you're making fun of it. Why the fuck would I need you?" The girl stood up and smiled. "Because it isn't over yet," she said. "What?" "Your life. The bullet's still in the gun, so it isn't over yet. That's how cause and effects work. Well, usually. Most of the time, anyway." He shook his head. "None of this makes sense," he said. It's suicide. Not making sense is par for the course. The girl strolled over to him, reached her arms out, and hugged him. What are you doing? He asked, uncomfortably. I thought you might need a hug. Isn't that something people do? Wish they could have been there to hug them? I don't know, he said, sadly. I'm also stealing this, she said quickly, pulling away and taking his pistol with her. Hey! He reached out to grab her, but she spun out of his grasp. Be careful with that! It's loaded! The girl rolled her eyes at him once again. Well, duh. Hard to kill yourself with an empty gun. She twirled the gun on her finger, expertly, then held the barrel to her nose and inhaled deeply. I love that smell. Don't you? What smell? He replied, annoyed. Gunpowder. The rain pounded into the windows around them. In the distance, rolling in the bay, thunder echoed. What? I haven't fired that gun in years. The girl smiled at him mischievously. Want to bet? She held the gun to her head, her smile frozen on her face. Then she jerked her head to the side in mimicry. He jumped. She laughed and pointed at him. Your face! You should see your face! She doubled over, clutching her stomach, still laughing. She glanced up again through her bangs and laughed harder. Seriously, do you have a mirror? It's so good. So, he started. Shush! She ran over to him and placed her finger on his lips. Wait, you can almost... Thunder shook the windows in their frames, sending them both to the ground, covering their ears. She rolled to her side, still holding her hands on her head, laughing. There! See? What the hell was that? She rolled to her knees and poked him on the side of the head. The pain seemed to stay there, burning into his skull. The gun, silly! It finally went off! You're on your way! Isn't this exciting? The gun? But the gun is... He looked around for the pistol. It had fallen on the floor during the thunder. What are you talking about? The pain inside of his head grew. It felt as if a bug was biting him, tunneling into his skull. You'll figure it out, she said, still smiling. In the meantime... She jumped up and ran to the couch, where she plopped down and grabbed the bag of popcorn once again. She threw a handful in the general direction of her mouth, missing with every kernel but one. She munched down on it as the others landed all around her. Let me know when you feel it coming out the other side, she said, between chews. I don't want to miss anything. So, wait, I'm dying? Sure, unless you can survive a bullet to the brain. She furrowed her brow. You wouldn't do that to me, would you? After all this effort? She pulled her lower lip out once again and pointed at it, accusingly. I'll try not to, he finished. The girl squealed. Awesome! I love the splash and the sound when the skull splits open. It's so good. You're crazy, he said. The girl shook her head. Which one of us just shot themselves, huh? Careful who you're calling crazy. That's different, he protested. I had reasons to do what I did. You're just being cruel. I'm not. How are you not? You're making this worse at every turn. Nuh-uh. You haven't even thought of why you did it since you pulled the trigger, have you? Not like you were before I showed up. Well, yeah, but that's not... Ta-da! She bowed from her sitting position on the sofa. And you're welcome, by the way. So you're some kind of consolation prize, keeping me company while I die? Sure, if you like. But is that what you are? No, not even a little. She tilted the bag toward him. Popcorn? The man stood there, the pain in his head progressing steadily. My brain itches, he said, finally. How is that even possible? It isn't. It can't. Your brain can't feel anything. You're just imagining it. He pulled a chair out from the table and sat backwards in it, facing her, leaning on the back. It doesn't feel like I'm imagining it. She shrugged. Good imagination? Nah, I couldn't even imagine my way out of my problems. He sighed. I thought you said people shouldn't joke about suicide, she teased. He glared at her in response. Oh, come on. You've got a few minutes left at max. Do you really want to spend it dwelling on why you killed yourself? He laughed through his nose and smiled. I guess not. The girl brought her knees up to her chin and rested her head on them. So, what's it like? I mean, you said it itches. What else? Actually, since you mentioned that it couldn't, it kinda went away. The girl visibly deflated. Well, that's boring. She took a deep breath and let it out slowly. I'm bored now. What, you want me to die quicker? She perked up. Could you? Shut up. He could feel pressure beginning to build on the other side of his head, near what would be the exit wound. He shivered at the thought. Do you think anyone will miss me? He asked, finally. The girl stared at him. You really are stupid, aren't you? She replied. I mean, I know, shot yourself, I should have known, but seriously. She shook her head. His face fell. Of course people will miss you, she finished. He looked up again. You think so? Well, sure. For a little while, anyway. A couple of years, maybe. A decade for people who you were really close to. They'll all beat themselves up with how they wish they could have stopped you or how they should have seen it coming and all that. But eventually, everyone will move on with their lives and forget about you. Everyone. What? Well, what did you expect? People to pine over you and weep at your graveside for the rest of their lives? He shrugged. I don't know. I guess I thought I was more important than that. She giggled to herself. Nope! But don't worry about it. Nobody is. People are built to cope and survive. She looked at the hole in the side of his head. Most people, she corrected herself. The pressure on the side of his head turned into a burning ache. He closed his eyes to try to focus on something other than the pain. It started out the other side, hasn't it? He nodded. Things will move quickly now. It'll all be over soon. She reached out and put a hand on his shoulder. Is there anything you want to say before you go? I can't think of anything. He struggled to get the words out. Hey, you wanted this. Remember? Yeah, but I didn't know it would hurt this much, he gasped. The girl laughed. Why does nobody ever think it'll hurt? She stood up and walked him to the window. Then she went and sat down. She leaned back into the sofa and grabbed her bag of popcorn. It's time. Are you ready? He didn't open his eyes, but he nodded. As the girl watched, his skull separated. Blood, bone, and brain sprayed in a crimson dance through the air. She applauded as it struck the perfectly white wall in a Rorschach chart of gore. Smiling, she walked up to the mess as the body began to fall. She picked up a little piece of brain and poked it gently. It wobbled in her palm. Hey, mister, she whispered. Could you feel the wall? The piece of brain didn't reply. The girl smiled. I hope you got what you wanted, she said. Then she kissed the bit of gray matter, set it back on the pile, and walked away. The gun went off like a jolt of thunder. In an instant, he was dead. All right, and that is today's reading. We will be back next Sunday, same time and same place. Just want to make sure we don't have any questions for the moment. And I think we are probably good to go. So thank you everybody for tuning in. Um, on behalf of Karen and myself, it means a lot to us to actually have everybody here listening and watching this. So see you guys next week.